Hello, my name is David Van Cleek. I'm a professor in the practice in the Center for Engineering Leadership at Rice University. Here on campus, I teach two courses, an undergraduate course for freshmen and sophomores, and a higher level course for seniors and graduate students. But a little bit about myself first. I too am an engineer. I did my undergraduate studies at Princeton University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering in 1973. While I was at Princeton, I was enrolled in ROTC and was commissioned as a second lieutenant when I graduated. After graduation, I was stationed by the Army in Italy and Germany for 4 years before I decided to return to graduate school here at Rice University. And I finished my PhD here in 1981. Following my studies here at Rice, I joined Shell Oil Company as a research engineer and spent over 34 years doing individual research and as a manager in their organization. During my last 15 years at Shell, I also was a campus recruiter. So I had many opportunities to be on campus, to interview students, looking for those skills that I thought would help those candidates fit best into Shell's organization. I was specifically interested in their leadership abilities. I also draw in my leadership philosophy from my experience as a Boy Scout adult leader. So you will see throughout the specialization that I will use concepts from military, industry, and my Boy Scout experience to present to you those skills that I think will be most valuable for you as an engineering leader. As I close, I'd like to leave you with this thought, and it comes from my LinkedIn profile. I help engineers learn leadership skills so they can leverage their creative and technical skills to make a better world for all of us. My passion is teaching, and my joy is seeing others use what I show them. Welcome to the first module in the Action Planning course. This course is one of 3 in the Leadership Development for Engineers specialization. The preferred order to take the courses is the Self-Awareness course first, followed by Relationship Management, and then this one on Action Planning. In this module, we'll begin with looking at the Leadership Development Plan. We'll look at this from 2 perspectives. First is, how do you take personal ownership of your own plan so that you get the best out of those things that need to be done to improve your leadership skills? Secondly, we'll look at it from the perspective of the leader. What are the things that you can do to help your followers develop as leaders as well? So with that in mind, let's proceed to my leadership observation for this module. People who don't want to be leaders generally don't make good leaders. We'll follow that up at the end of the module with the second half of the observation. Let's take a look at our objectives for this module. First, we'll look at prioritizing leadership competencies. In the first course in this specialization, we looked at the RCEL leadership framework. We'll draw extensively on that as we work on our leadership competencies in this module. If you have a framework that your particular organization uses, feel free to use that as you develop your action plan. We'll assess those competencies and identify what our current skill is and what the target skill is that we need to achieve in order to be most effective. We'll select certain competencies for further development. We can't select them all, so we'll have to prioritize those in such a way that we can pick the right ones for current work. Then we'll prepare goals for each of those that are well structured, and we'll have a separate module in this specialization devoted exclusively to how to set SMART goals. Lastly, we'll summarize those steps that need to be taken in order to have an effective action plan. As we work throughout this module and the specialization, we'll be targeting those things that you need to be doing to have a documented, well-structured action plan that you can implement and achieve results in the near term. Your leadership development shouldn't be an accidental process. There should be nothing random about it, and it should be ordered and disciplined. In that regard, I've developed a 6-step planning process that I think applies to most circumstances that you're likely to encounter in the workplace. It begins with identifying and prioritizing the competencies from whatever leadership framework you're using, whether it's the RCEL framework that we use in this course or the one from your own particular workplace. Second in this process is to assess the current and target skill levels that are needed to perform effectively in your current role. Next, we compare the current skills with the target skills to determine the gaps in performance, those that might need to be addressed through the development of a supporting action plan. We then select the competencies for future development, then work on developing an action plan that consists of SMART goals. This is an acronym that describes the format for crafting a well-developed and effective goal for your competencies. Lastly, you execute and track that plan. And this obviously then becomes an iterative process where you cycle through these steps many times until you achieve the desired skill level for any particular competency. We'll refer to this particular process throughout this course as a way of not only owning your own leadership development, but as a process that you can use when you're in the lead role and developing your followers. The first step in the leadership planning process is to prioritize the leadership competencies for whatever framework we're using in our workplace, whether it's the RCEL framework or your own from your own workplace. Also, as part of this first step, we will use the prioritization matrix that we've introduced in other modules within this specialization. It was part of the reading that you were assigned before this lesson. I'll revisit it here just to refresh our memories. This was the Stephen Covey 4-quadrant method of prioritizing activities. Here we're balancing the importance versus the urgency. We assign, in this particular case, a Roman numeral to the highest and most urgent priorities, and then categorize all of the competencies in one of these 4 boxes. So now we'll refer to the actual competency matrix, again, part of the readings for this course. This happens to be an extract from the personal domain of leadership competencies. The matrix lists the competency itself, some of the characteristics of that competency, and then there are 4 columns that have additional information. The first column is the initial assessment. This will be, for the first time you go through this assessment process, what is your current assessment of your skill level based again on the Bloom's taxonomy that we'll refer again to in our second module in this course. The second column is the current assessment. As you iterate through the planning process, that current assessment will change. For your first time through, obviously the current assessment and the initial assessment are the same. There then will be a column for the target level. Based on discussions that you've had with your manager, your supervision, you will decide on what the target level is for each of the leadership competencies. This should be a cooperative effort between you and your manager. When you're in the leadership role, you should help your followers decide what the target level is for each of the competencies. Lastly, there's a column specifically for the prioritization of the leadership competency. Recognize that within the RCEL framework, there are a total of 21 competencies, and we're going to rank order these for your individual situation 2 ways. First, we'll assign the priority based on the Covey 4-quadrant matrix that we used in the previous slide. As our first pass through this process, we'll assign that what matrix or what box does it fall in the prioritization matrix. I would expect for the most part these are going to be either 1 or 2. If they weren't important, they probably don't deserve to be prioritized within a domain of leadership competencies. So, in this particular example, we'll assign a box for each of the competencies in this particular matrix extract. Here we've assigned Roman numerals 1 or 2 based on what we feel is the relative priority of this particular competency. Again, there are going to be a variety of subjective factors that help you determine what that priority is, whether it's important or urgent. As our second pass through the matrix, we're going to rank order the competencies within each domain. This will be a number that we assign based again on subjective or maybe even some objective measures and inputs from other people on what the relative importance of the skill level or the competency is within this particular domain. We then combine the rankings to give us an overall assessment that has two characteristics: a measure of importance and urgency, and also a rank order within the domain. This will allow us then to have a sense for which are the most important competencies to work on as we develop our plan of action with the supporting goals. This then is the first step in our leadership development planning process that gets us the start for selecting which competencies and which goals that we will set and track as we grow our leadership skills. The second step in the leadership development planning process is to assess the current level of skill in each of our leadership competencies. To do this, we'll reintroduce a couple of tools that we've seen previously. We begin with the Rice Center for Engineering Leadership, or RCEL, Leadership Competency Framework. It consists of 4 levels: the personal, interpersonal, managerial, and the leadership domains, held together with a common thread of communication. We'll look very briefly at each of these domains before we proceed to our next step in the assessment process. Begin with the personal domain. These are the 5 competencies within that domain that we will be individually assessing. Second is the interpersonal level, which we covered in great detail in our second course in the specialization. The managerial, these are some of the housekeeping things that leaders have to do. And then more of the executive leadership skills that you might see in senior leaders. We then proceed to the scale on which we will assess all of these leadership competencies. We introduced Bloom's taxonomy in the self-awareness course, and it's going to be used here as we look at the various levels for assessing our leadership skill, beginning with the remembering level, the understanding, the applying, the analyzing, the evaluating, and the creating levels. My experience with most new engineers in their first 5 years of employment in an organization is that they're typically operating at the level 2 or level 3 skill level on this scale. When I was recruiting students on the college campus, I was looking for those that were at least in those ranges. This then is the scale that we use to determine not just your current skill level, but what is the target level that we wish to achieve. We then continue by collecting all of the assessment material that we have, whether it's the self-assessments that you've done as part of this course, external feedback that you might have. Also, the reflections from your leadership journal will become important to you here as you look back on your own experiences that help you determine what your current skill level is. We'll then introduce to you a spreadsheet tool that you can use to enter the data and collect it and analyze it with some pre-formatted charts, one of which we'll examine shortly. From the competencies and that you collect, you may not have all of the information that you need. There are some of the competencies in the RCEL Leadership Framework for which there is not a corresponding self-assessment. When this occurs, you'll have to use the external feedback that you have and your personal reflections to make an assessment of what your current skill level is. As I said earlier, you'll want to confirm what the target level for this proficiency is with your particular manager. This will be important as you proceed to the next step, where we're going to be looking at the gaps between your current assessment and what that target will be. With all of the self-assessments collected, the data entered in the spreadsheet, and the charts generated that begin to give you a map of what your current skill levels are, we can begin to determine which of those might be the most important to work on, and we'll proceed to that in the next step of the leadership development plan process. With all of the data compiled and entered into the leadership framework spreadsheet, we're now ready to move on to our third step in the leadership development planning process. and that is to determine the gaps in skill levels. That is the gap between our current and target skill levels. The first step in this is going to be using the spreadsheet to generate the radar plots. Sometimes these plots are referred to as spider charts. These will be plots that actually show the current and target levels for each of the competencies within a RSEL leadership domain. We'll look at where the gaps are the greatest, because these become potential candidates for further development. We'll identify those candidates where there are significant gaps and label them as priority competencies. We'll then compare those priority competencies against the prioritized list that we did in the first lesson of this module. When you identify priority competencies and they line up well with high priority competencies from your initial steps in this leadership development planning process, then you have a match that might give you some clue as to what should be your candidate competencies for further development. Let's take a look at an example. Here's an example of a radar plot from the personal domain showing the 5 leadership competencies plotted. Here what we see are 2 examples where the target and the current level of proficiency are the same. There is no gap. On 2 others, there's a gap of 1 skill level, and on a third, the setting of goals, there's actually a gap of 2. As we look at these competencies and the gaps that are in place, it might suggest that the goal setting one could be a candidate for further development if it also matches up with a high priority competency that you did in the initial prioritization process. One word of caution as we move forward to the competency selection. Just because there is no gap does not mean that a particular competency is not worthy of being a candidate for further development. It may be that that is a highly important, highly urgent competency that needs to be sustained and could be very important for your future development. So as a result, you're going to use a qualitative assessment to begin the process of picking those competencies that you'll use for action planning. What I've shown here is clearly those competencies where there's a gap could well be those that you choose. However, I wanted to point out that there are other reasons why you might pick a particular competency for further development. As you look at the competencies that you begin to identify as candidates for goal setting, one of the things that you should consider is to what extent are you emotionally attached to that particular competency and willing to devote the effort that it's going to take to implement an action plan. Otherwise, that action plan will not be one that you can commit to and execute effectively, and as a result, your skill level will not improve. Having identified the gaps in our skill levels or identified those competencies that we determine merit further development, we now want to consider those things that we could do to actually close that gaps or make our current skill level improve. So let's take a look at what some of the options are around what we call learning experiences. These are going to range from the job structure that you currently have. Are there some options around restructuring your job that might give you the experience of practicing the skills needed to make some improvements? Whether it's restructuring the assignment or offering some opportunity for mentoring and coaching, those are things that you can consider to incorporate into your formal plan of action for improving your competency level. Alternatively, you may look at formal training. This is a classic way of closing the gap in ability or skills that you might need to further develop. Whether that training is internal or external doesn't really matter, but you will want to, as part of your planning process, to identify both. What are those internal training opportunities within your organization, and what are the external ones that are available reasonably close nearby? There may be some self-directed activities that you can consider as you develop those skills as well. One of the ones that you are doing right now, in fact, is this distance learning course. This is an example of one of the ways that you can address specific skills. There are others. You can use your network of professional contacts that might also be useful in providing information and helping again to address some specific development needs. As we consider all of these options for our action planning, we'll want to also consider the relative effectiveness of each of these approaches. In that regard, I've rank ordered here the various approaches in what I consider to be most or least effective to most effective from low to high. That does not mean to say that these different approaches aren't useful. They are. It's only that the most effective ones will be at the high end of this scale. So as we look at the lowest level in this scale, conferences and reading do play a good role. However, they're relatively passive. You can't learn how to ride a bicycle by reading about it. There's the training approach that we just discussed. Are there some formal and informal training opportunities that you can use to build ability in various leadership competencies? Feedback is always important to developing improvement. So having a coach or a mentor in your assignment can be very, very helpful in understanding those areas where you can make improvement and letting you know when you're doing well and closing the gaps. We talked about job broadening. Here, we're actually using some of the skills and getting opportunity to practice through varied job assignments. And at the top of the scale is actually doing and using the skills. This is the riding the bicycle level of mastering various skills. You can't really master them until you actually are performing them to some extent. Again, I've ranked these from least effective to most effective, or least impactful to most impactful, as well as to what extent are they active or passive. The most proactive part of this scale is at the top. These then would be some of the things that we would want to consider as we then move forward to developing our action plan. The key deliverable from this particular course is the leadership development plan that you will write for yourself. With that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the components of this plan that you will have to address as you do the writing assignment. First, I want you to set what is your vision. What is it that you see as success for you as you implement your leadership development plan? This could be either the vision or your statement of purpose. What is it that you do and why do you do it? What are your aspirations for your career? And in this regard, for both the vision and your aspirations, I would like for you to take a 5 to 10 year outlook on what you want to accomplish. We then prepare an action plan, and that action plan consists of a set of goals. Specifically, you're going to select a minimum of 4 competencies on which you wish to work. These are going to be competencies that are important, urgent, or for which there's a significant gap that needs to be closed. They also need to be ones that you are willing to devote the personal energy and commitment to conduct the action plan and see it through to completion. You'll develop a list of actionable items that you can do to make improvements in those leadership skills, and we just referred to some of those in the previous lesson. From those then you'll develop a list of SMART goals. We will address the development of SMART goals very specifically in the next module. However, what I want you to keep in mind is that that set of SMART goals will address some specific behaviors that you'll need to improve or want to improve. It'll express a time frame in which you wish to do it. It'll have some mechanism for accountability. Do you have to report out, or do you have to track it in some way that's very visible? And lastly, there should be some measure of success. How do you know when you've completed the goal successfully? I think a significant part of that is that you ought to include a reward for yourself for accomplishing your goals. All this then are the things that you will need to consider as you develop your written leadership development plan. Welcome to the toolkit segment for this module. Part of life in any organization is a formal appraisal process. For most of us, that means having an appraisal at least once a year. If you could have one more frequently, that would be even better. So what I would like to cover here are the steps that you should consider going through as you prepare for that formal appraisal. As I talked in our prior specialization about conducting meetings, this requires significant preparation on your part in order for it to be most effective. As you think about preparing for that annual performance appraisal, start with a well-crafted leadership development plan. We've spent most of this module going through the steps that you need to take to have that plan in place. Without that plan, it's very difficult to have an objective performance appraisal. As you prepare for the actual appraisal meeting, do a current assessment of your goals. Make sure that you know where you are in the tracking process and where the milestones are as far as completion are concerned. Make sure that you identify a new set of goals. For many of us, this means a continuation of goals that are actually in progress. That could be extensions or modifications of those goals, or to the extent that you're aware of new work coming your direction, you might want to include some new goals related to those. As you think about those goals, make sure that you refresh the status of those that are ongoing, that you make sure that you adjust skill level that you currently have. If you've been successful in accomplishing the goals, your skill level could have changed, so you'll want to update that as well. Also, the target skill level could have changed, so make sure that you consider how that might be adjusted as part of your plan. As you create new goals, make sure that you're using the SMART goal format that we'll talk about in the next module. As you approach the formal appraisal, you should assume that this is a coaching session as opposed to a counseling session. And by that I mean that all of the discussion will focus on performance as opposed to behavior. As you think about a coaching session, this should be a collaborative session where you're using supportive communications techniques on both sides of the table. As you think about that, make sure that you're using a collaborative approach in setting new goals, that you're clear on the scope definition and the timing of those particular goals. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail here. Make sure that the goals that you have align with the business needs and, to the extent that you can, with your own personal aspirations and personal development needs. Make sure that you and your leader agree on the skill levels that are necessary to accomplish the goals and on the targets that you'll be striving to achieve. Make sure that you have a resource plan associated with any of the goals and that they're validated and that the leader buys into providing those resources necessary for you to accomplish your work. If a goal revolves around a job broadening or job structure change, make sure that that's clearly identified as part of the plan and is considered as a potential enhancement to your personal development. You should schedule the performance appraisal at a time that's convenient for both you and your leader so that you have adequate time to prepare for it ahead of time and also adequate time to conduct the session itself. Rushing through a performance appraisal is not going to get you the results that you desire. My own experience in conducting appraisals was that I would typically allow at least 2 hours for an effective discussion to occur. As you schedule that time, make sure that you both arrive at a consensus on what the performance was achieved, what performance level, what skills, what accomplishments, so that the picture is the same. As the manager, and when you're in the role of conducting these appraisals, make sure that you don't make promises with regard to salary increases or promotions or the things that are outside of your control. So be cautious of making promises you can't keep. By the same token, if you're receiving the appraisal, make sure that you don't make unreasonable requests, that you don't ask for things that are outside the ability of the manager or the leader to deliver. As with starting this whole process, you must end with a formal, documented leadership development plan. This begins the cycle again through accomplishing your goals with a complete leadership development plan that grows you over time and enhances your skills and your ability to contribute to the organization. As you can see from these steps, the process of preparing your annual appraisal is a very deliberate one. The extent to which you commit the effort needed to doing that well will determine the effectiveness of the outcome. Welcome to the journaling segment for our first module in the Action Planning course. Today we're coming to you from the academic quadrangle just to the west of the Brockstein Pavilion, which you can see behind me. We'll be doing the video segments for the journaling articles from here throughout the remainder of this course. Today our focus is on the Leadership Development Planning module that we have just been working on. I'm going to draw a little bit from my personal experience, but I want to flip the topic a little bit because in this module we were talking primarily from you owning your own development plan. Now I'd like to refer a little bit to how would you manage this when you're the leader and you are developing your followers. From my own experience, both in the Army and at Shell, I found that one of the keys to helping my followers develop their leadership plans was to get to know them as best I could. I had to use a variety of tools to do that. I'd use prior assessments. I talked to people who had worked with my followers in the past, using a variety of formal and informal processes to better get to know my followers. I needed to know what was important to them. What was it that drew them to want to be doing the jobs that they were doing? Spend some time talking to them to understand what their values were, what their attitudes and interests were, so that I could better use those as I helped them through coaching and counseling. It also was a great aid to me as I tried to adapt the right extrinsic and intrinsic rewards to help sustain their motivation and thus their performance. It also is extremely useful as we set goals so that I could adapt the job assignments and again the rewards that would be appropriate to keep their motivation high and thus lead to better performance. If you can make the connection between the intrinsic rewards and values of your followers, you'll find that you will go a long way to helping sustain their job satisfaction. We've now reached the end of our first module in the Action Planning course, namely to create a leadership development plan that will allow us to improve our competencies or skill levels according to whatever framework we're using. Now it's time to look at my personal leadership observation for this course, namely that people who don't want to be leaders generally don't make good leaders. The flip side of this is that people who want to be leaders for the wrong reasons also generally don't make very good leaders. Now let's take a look at the leadership development planning process that we've used throughout this module. We begin by prioritizing the competencies, again, from whatever framework is appropriate, whether it's the RCEL framework that we have used in this specialization or a leadership framework from your own organization. We then assess current skill level, where are we today? And through conversations with our managers, identify the target levels that are appropriate for our role. We then look at the gaps between where we are now and where we would like to be. We use the radar plots as part of this process to help us visualize what those gaps are. From that, then, we select the appropriate competencies for development. And this involved a comparison of those skills where there are gaps to our prioritization that we did at the beginning of the process. With the appropriate competencies selected, we can then begin to develop SMART goals or an action plan that we will use to close the gaps or to sustain skills based on those competencies that we selected. Lastly, we will execute that plan and track our progress so that we know when we've actually completed it or we're ready to reset and develop a new set of goals. This is an iterative process that you will use to incrementally improve all of your skills in your leadership development plan. We will want to use this process throughout the rest of this course as we develop our skills, either from the follower or from the leadership perspective. Welcome to our second module in the Action Planning course. In this module, we'll look much more closely at goal setting, the tools that you will need to be much more effective as both a leader and as a follower. But first, let's take a look at my leadership observation for this module. Good leaders make mistakes and then fix them. They don't leave them for others to clean up. Now let's move on to our objectives for this module. First, we're going to look at some ways that you can be proactive in setting goals. To the extent that you have control over your own goals will give you the motivation that you need to complete them effectively. We'll look at what SMART goals are, what the acronym stands for, and what the components of a good SMART goal are. We'll actually use that template to prepare a goal related to a leadership competency. We'll look at how you develop action plans to support that SMART goal. The goal itself is not enough. You have to have an actionable plan composed of all the right steps that will allow you to complete the goal. And lastly, we'll look at the resources, the ways of finding the resources and identifying them so that you can reinforce the action plan that you have to complete your goals. As we look at ways to create good goals, we'll also consider what I call the articles of faith of creating meaningful goals. First, good objectives cause us to work on the right things. Good goals produce good results. And lastly, good action plans give us a way to measure our progress so that we know where we are at any given time. The underlying theme of this module is that it is you who owns the responsibility for your own leadership development. If you rely on others, you're likely to be very disappointed. So in that regard, we'll use two leadership models that I will flip around and look at them from the perspective of the follower and the things that you can use to develop your own leadership plans. As we begin to set goals, let's begin by looking at one leadership model, and that is one proposed by Peter Kostenbaum in his book, Leadership, the Inner Side of Greatness. He proposed a model that referred to the leadership diamond. My teaching partner here on campus, Tom Phelan, has adapted this to look at what you as an individual should be doing to grow your own leadership greatness. So let's begin with defining your personal reality. Here, have you done the things to establish the facts around your skills and abilities as a leader? We started early on in the specialization doing self-assessments and have continued that process throughout the learning in this specialization. You've done a number of self-assessments to give you a picture of where you currently stand with regard to a variety of skills. Have you learned from your leadership experience and begun to apply those lessons? Have you gotten feedback from others to get good information about where you do well and where you need perhaps some improvement? And have you done the self-reflection, as we've done throughout the specialization in the leadership journals, to internalize the lessons not only of the lectures but from your personal experiences? Do you have a personal vision? Do you have some idea of what kind of leader you want to be and what your future self will look like? What will you be in 5 to 10 years? And do you have aspirations that go along with that? As you think about your personal ethics, what are your values? Where do they come from? And what are your cultural norms that might influence your leadership style and your leadership development? How do you treat other people? That will be key to how you grow your leadership skills. As we move on to your personal courage, this really reflects the commitment that you're going to have to set meaningful goals and to take action to accomplish those goals. In this module, we will be spending a lot of time talking about SMART goals. We'll define that acronym and go into great detail about the mechanics of how to set those goals. Ultimately, this is all about how you can grow to become better, how you can grow this circle to increase your personal greatness. As we begin to set goals, we're going to have to balance the difficulty of the goal against our ability to accomplish the goal. We're reminded of the classic expression, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. That's one way to approach managing the challenge of the goal, but there are some consequences of that you have to be aware of. We can only eat elephant for so long. Let's look then at how we might chart the types of goals that we would like to set for ourselves such that they are appropriately challenging and interesting. If the challenge is not matched well against ability, in other words, low challenge, not requiring a lot of ability, these are typically the goals that we get not very excited about. I'm reminded of the video gamer who doesn't play certain games because they're too easy, they're not challenging enough. However, when the goal gets super challenging and exceeds our ability to execute it, we end up in a place where high stress is called, resulting in anxiety. Conversely, if our ability is high but the challenge is low, we can get easily bored with that particular goal. So what we would like to do is match appropriately the challenge with our abilities and push ourselves to the upper right-hand portion of this box where we get high performance using challenging goals matched against high ability. We can look at this another way by thinking about this representation of our comfort zone. This is a place where we can operate easily, accomplish tasks with a minimum amount of stress or difficulty. However, there is a region outside of that comfort zone where we call this the stretch. I had a very good mentor early in my career who told me that all real learning occurs when you operate outside of your comfort zone. This is the region where we should be looking to set our goals. These are the challenging goals. However, there is a limit. We have to watch out that we don't exceed the edge and end up in what we refer to as the panic zone. As you set your goals, be conscious of where these regions are and aware of what your limits might be so that we can effectively set the challenging goals that you're going to need to improve your performance as a leader. As we continue the theme of proactively managing your own leadership development, I'd like to introduce a model that we will use extensively in our fourth module in this course when we use it to help understand how a leader can influence motivation in their organization. In our context here, first let's begin by defining what we mean by performance. Performance is actually the product of ability, motivation, and the situation. We will examine each of these in its own context to see where you might have an opportunity to own pieces of it and develop action plans and goals that relate to each component of this performance model. We'll begin then by looking at ability, the ability piece. It's composed of your aptitude to do the job, what is your natural inclination and ability to do it, what training do you have or what training might you need to be able to grow the skills to grow your ability, and lastly, what resources might you need in order to accomplish the goals that will build skills. Let's look at each of these individually. As we look at aptitude, I begin by using an acronym from my Army experience, BLUF, bottom line up front. This is the take-home message that I would like for you to get from each of these pieces of the model. First, find out what you like doing. If you like doing it, you're much more likely to have high performance. But in that regard, what insights have you gotten from all of the work that you've done in this specialization? What strengths have you identified? And in particular, what are you really good at that you already know about, that you've gotten from your feedback and from your personal reflections? As we think about training, what do you really need to do the job that you currently have? Are there some skills that you're not particularly good at where training might actually help you improve your performance? So, what's your skill level? We've been looking at that through a variety of assessments and from feedback. What does that skill level need to be? And we looked at that extensively in the first module in this course. As you think about resources, what time, facilities, money, or other connections might you need in order to accomplish your goals? As we structure a SMART goal, one of the things that we're going to spend a great deal of time on is looking at the action plan piece and the resources that you're going to need to accomplish the goal. So being as complete as you can in identifying time, money, facilities, equipment, those kinds of things will be vital in establishing the resources you need to be successful in completing your leadership development goals. So let's look at the second component of the performance model, motivation. Key to accomplishing any goal is maintaining that motivation. The best structured goals will not be effective unless your motivation remains high. The primary components of the motivation piece of the performance model are desire and commitment. Let's look at each of these. Desire really refers to understanding why is that goal important to you? What is it about the goal that makes it attractive and makes you want to work on it? In particular, what are the values that it aligns with? Do the goals that you're working on related to this particular improvement task, do they line up well with the organization? Do they line up with your personal values? When we think about commitment, this is the willingness to commit the energy to accomplish the goal. Do you have that? And understanding why you're committed to a goal will help you reinforce those times when your commitment fades a little bit and needs to be reinforced. What are the intangibles that go along with the particular goal that you're working on that make it valuable and will help keep you committed to accomplishing the goal? When we think about the third component in the performance model, what is the situation? What's the context in which the goal is being conducted? Here, the environment, the relationships, and the opportunities define what the situation is. And let's take a quicker look at these. As you think about them, opportunities really are there broadening assignments that you could take on? Are there ways to expand the responsibilities or the components of the job that might make it a little bit more challenging and might create that stretch that we talked about previously? When we think about relationships, are there people who can help you? Are there coaches and mentors within the organization that you might be able to draw on to help you with your assessments and to give you advice when you need it? And lastly, when we think about the environments, are there structural components of the job that might be altered or the work environment that might be changed that would help reinforce your ability to accomplish your goal? When we put all of these together, we have the complete performance model. I believe that as you look at each of these components, there's an opportunity for you to take personal ownership and to develop your goals such that they improve each of the three components of the performance model and result in overall much higher performance. As we consider this model, we'll now start to look at how we can develop those leadership development goals that will help you become an outstanding leader. For those of you who've already taken the self-awareness course in this specialization, you've seen some discussion of SMART goals. I'd like to repeat some of that here so that we refresh our memories as we prepare our own leadership development goals. So let's look at what constitutes SMART goals. First of all, we use the acronym SMART. That means specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. This acronym helps us structure a goal so that it has the components we need to improve our chances of success. Having a SMART goal stated this way, however, isn't enough, and we'll explore that further in just a moment. As we think about structuring a SMART goal, we begin by stating an objective. This really is a statement that tells where we're going and is action-oriented, contains a verb to show that not only is there action involved, but that you own that action. And lastly, there's sufficient information contained in that statement of the objective that it makes it clear what the goal really is about. We'll choose our actions from a long list of potential verbs. The primary reason for doing this is to establish ownership and to emphasize the fact that something will actually happen. We then construct our SMART goal using the clarified objective and adding to that some specific measures and time bounds so that we have the complete SMART goal. However, no goal is complete until we add in the action plan, that list of bite-sized steps that need to be taken in order to accomplish a much larger goal. Those action steps also need to be time-bound. And lastly, we need a resource plan that makes sure that we have all the essential elements that will allow us to accomplish the goal. Without either the action plan or the resources, the goal is just wishful thinking. So with this model in mind for what constitutes structuring a well-crafted goal, let's go create a real leadership development goal. In an earlier lecture, we talked about the format and how to set up a SMART goal. In this lecture, let's take a look at a specific example that I think will apply to you as you complete this course. We'll begin by composing what I call the clarified objective. This is the what we're going to do part of the SMART goal. As I indicated earlier, we begin with a verb. In this case, we're going to write. What is it we're going to write? We're going to write a leadership development plan. What are the clarifying information? Well, that's contained in the instructions for the assignment. So we're going to write a leadership development plan that conforms to the requirements outlined in the assignment. This gives us the specific part of the goal that we're going to complete. So again, to refresh what the acronym means, specific, yes, we're talking about the clarified objective. It'll be measurable, and in this we're going to use not only the completion of the various action steps, but in this particular case, you have a rubric that you can use to assess, have you completed all the necessary elements satisfactorily? It'll be action-oriented. Yes, we're going to write this particular document. It will be realistic. Can it be done with the tools and resources available? We'll review the resources as part of our action planning part of the goal. It'll be time limited. Yes, you'll have to complete the assignment within the time bounds of completing this course. You have some flexibility in that, so we'll build that into our action plan. With this information in hand, let's move now to looking at specifically the action plan. We begin by restating our clarified objective. What are the measurable targets here? What's the measurable goal? Well, all of the elements that need to be in that paper are going to be there. It'll meet the requirements of the rubric and utilize all of the resources that you will have available to complete the paper. What's the time limit? You have to complete it before the end of the course. You have some flexibility in how you schedule your modules, so I've referred here to completing it at the end of the 4th module. This then becomes a statement of our SMART goal. As I said earlier, this is not complete until we do the action plan and identify the resources that we need. So let's take a look at the action plan. Here I've laid out the steps that I think logically fit with this assignment that you have to complete, and I've identified a tentative timeline for when those particular items need to be completed. These are fairly easy to know whether you've completed it or not, so our measure really is the action item complete or not? This becomes a checklist that you can use as you prepare the paper for submission. Note that I also have added a supplemental time period where you actually have to conduct peer reviews for papers that your additional learners in the course, your associates in the course, will be completing at the same time. You don't get your grade until those peer reviews are completed. With the strategy in place, the action steps that we need to complete the paper, we can begin to look at the resources. Here are the list of resources that I think that you will need to complete the leadership development plan. These have been included either in the course or as part of the required course reading materials. Together, the statement of the SMART goal, the action plan, and the resources comprise a meaningful SMART goal that you can act upon. If you can use this format for all of your goals, whether they're your leadership goals or your technical goals, you will see dramatic improvement in all of your skills. In addition to having a well-crafted SMART goal supported by a good action plan and the resources needed to accomplish the goal, I feel it's important that tracking is extremely important to sustain your commitment to accomplishing the goal. So as we look at tracking your goals, what are the things that you should be doing? First, make sure that the action items in your action item plan are being tracked. Do you know what their current status is? Are you checking them off as they're being completed? Are you doing project reviews or progress reviews with your manager so that you have an opportunity to show where you are and share that with your manager so that they stay informed and, when needed, either intervene or assist as needed to help you accomplish the goal? When you think about tracking, there are a variety of tools out there. From the project management world, there are Gantt charts. You can use to-do lists or use spreadsheets. We'll examine a couple of these in more detail in our next lesson in this module. However, what I'd like for you to keep in mind is that whatever you use, whatever tool you use, it's important that you write it down so that you know where you are on accomplishing your goals. Welcome to the Toolkit segment of our goal setting module. Throughout this course, I've referred to the alignment of goals within an organization. During my years as a manager at Shell, one of the things that I tried to do with my staff was to show them how they fit within the organization. In that time, I developed a tool that I called the Balanced Scorecard. I'd like to review that tool with you here so that you can see how you might be able to help your staff understand their contribution to the overall organization. I begin with collecting some resources that we'll need to construct this balanced scorecard. First is a set of what the corporate objectives might be. I picked some here as an illustration of what some of them might be in a large engineering organization. These mirror some of the ones that Shell had during my time as an employee at Shell. We then collect some information related to the strategies of the company, and Michael Tracy in his work described three value propositions that most companies might tie into. At any given time, Tracy indicates that a company is probably good at only two out of these three. We'll illustrate all three in this particular case. Next, I've assumed in this case that we have an organization that has multiple layers. There's a corporate layer, some business units, and then teams within the business unit. I've chosen those three levels for simplicity. However, your organization may have many more than that, and this process can be applied with multiple levels as well. It gets a little bit more complicated, but it can be done. And lastly, I've identified some key business processes that might occur within a business unit. What are those activities that might have goals associated with them or measurable targets within the organization? With these in hand, then I begin to array these all the way from the senior level of the corporation down to the individual. I begin by listing the corporate objectives, the value proposition. What are the business objectives that might be outlined in their business plans? What are the processes that are associated with particular goals? What are the specific measurable business goals? What are the team activities and goals that you might have for your particular team? What are the projects that you're doing that are within that team? And lastly, what is the value of the work? As I've said multiple times, understanding the value of the work is I believe, critical element of motivation to buy into the particular goals at hand. With this framework in mind, let's array some of the corporate goals. Here I've chosen three fairly different corporate objectives. Here I'll match them to the Tracy model where I've identified the specific value proposition associated with that corporate strategy, whether it's operational excellence, product leadership, or customer intimacy. Then I'll array the business objectives that we had previously collected, whether it's profitability, being a leading supplier, or developing new products that are associated with those value propositions and the corporate objectives. Behind that would be the work processes within the business unit that are connected to those specific objectives. Then, to the extent that there are measurable targets within the business unit, we can associate those with these same work processes and business goals. We then align the team activities for your particular team within the business unit. Lastly, we associate whatever work you're doing with that particular activity that aligns with all the way up the chain to the corporate objectives. And while I've shown 3 projects here, not all of those may be yours. They be other members of your team that are working in those particular projects. Lastly, we associate a value with each of the goals, each of the projects. As I've indicated elsewhere, my opinion is that the value of your portfolio within your team should be at least 10 times your annual salary. If you can align your personal goals in this manner all the way through the organization to the senior levels, you can accomplish this for both your leadership goals and your technical ones. And if you can do that for you and your followers, you will dramatically improve the motivation and the commitment of your staff to achieving the corporate objectives. Welcome to the video segment for our second module in the Action Planning course. We come to you again from the Brockstein Pavilion on the Rice University campus. In this module, we focused on goal setting. In my video segment here, I'd like to focus attention both on the leader and followers' roles in aligning their goals. I have what I call the imperatives of goal setting. First among those, drawing from my own experience both in the Army and at Shell, is that it's an important first step to make sure that your goals are aligned with those of the organization. One of the best ways to make sure that that happens is to support the goals of your manager. Understanding what their goals are and finding out where you fit to help support those can be very important to your own success. It's also vital that you understand how the work that you do fits into supporting the overall mission of the organization. Knowing how you contribute and what your part is can help sustain your own motivation. That will be important when you are the leader to ensure that you can communicate how the work of your followers fits and supports the organization. Lastly, I think that it's also exceptionally important that every employee understand the value of the work that they do. The rule of thumb that I like to use for engineers is that the portfolio of work that you work on should be worth at least 10 times your annual salary. Knowing the value of your work and how you fit into the organization are keys to your success in contributing effectively to the organization. We've now reached the end of our second module in the Action Planning course. So that means it's time to take a look at my leadership observation. Good leaders make mistakes and then they fix them. As I said earlier at the outset of the module, leaders are expected to clean up their own messes. However, great leaders learn from their mistakes and they don't repeat them. So let's take a look now at what we reviewed in this module. We talked about developing your inner greatness, those dimensions of what leadership aspects you would be setting goals around and improving to expand that personal greatness. We talked about the considerations in setting goals, the need to balance challenge with ability. We talked about proactivity in managing your goals and used the performance model as a way to identify those areas for focus. We talked about crafting SMART goals, using that template and that methodology to make sure that we included all of the things that are necessary to have an effective goal. We talked about the mechanics of actually creating a leadership development goal and demonstrated that. And then lastly, we talked about how do you track your progress so that you in fact know when you're done. If you can accomplish the elements of creating SMART goals and implement them effectively, you are well on your way to becoming a great leader. Welcome to Module 3 in our course on action planning. Working in teams has become a way of life for engineers. In this course, we'll examine some team dynamics and explore some ways that you can build creative, high-performing teams. But first, let's take a look at my leadership observation for this module. Good leaders react well to unexpected circumstances. This is a trait that goes hand in hand with having an internal locus of control, as we discussed in the self-awareness course. Now let's take a look at our objectives for this course. First, we will look at the stages of team development that all teams go through and how they evolve over time. We'll look at the influence of the forming stage and how that impacts the ultimate success of a team. We'll then shift and look at the role of the followers in the team and the fact that all participants in a team have some accountability for the overall success. We'll then describe what an exemplary follower might look like in a high-performing team. We'll spend some time talking about actually launching a team, an activity that you might have to do as a leader in an engineering organization. And then lastly, we'll take a look at what does a high-performing team really look like. Few of us ever get a chance to experience that firsthand very many times. Being a member of a team is inevitable. It's in your best interest as an engineer and as a leader to understand how to ensure that your team can deliver results in a manner that exceeds expectations. Before we explore how to launch teams, it's useful to take some time to examine how teams actually evolve over time. We're going to call this our model of group development. This model was originally proposed by Tuckman in 1965 and consisted of 4 stages: a forming, storming, norming, and performing stage. In our text, the Wetton and Cameron textbook that we're using for this course, they've slightly altered that order to reverse storming and norming. There are good reasons for doing this based on their observations of how groups actually evolve. I don't think it's especially important which order they're in, as long as we understand which stage we're in and what the characteristics are. In the context of engineering teams, I've added a 5th stage that is representative of how temporary teams might be formed and conduct their work as they execute projects. And we call this the adjourning stage. This is used where teams have a finite lifetime and are not permanent teams. Let's begin then with the forming stage. When groups of people are initially brought together, for the most part, they're polite, they're cordial, but they may not know the other members of the team. This is particularly true when you bring multidisciplinary teams together from different parts of the organization. In this environment, typically, as the new participants are getting involved in the project, they're high on enthusiasm, but they're a little bit low on trust because they don't know the other members of the team. Getting a team productive at this stage can be a little bit difficult because of the lack of established relationships. One of the primary concerns of a team in the forming stage is to start building that understanding of one team member for another so that they can build trust and ultimately move towards an interdependent way of operating. In this stage, the team should be looking at establishing what its group norms will be. Frequently, it's best to do this in the form of the team charter or terms of reference, whatever phrase you use to describe the document that organizes the team and sets expectations and roles. But part of that forming stage should include a description of behaviors that are acceptable and not acceptable in the group, establishing work processes that will be helpful in delivering work, and in particular, those processes that the team might want to use and consider using, and in times when they experience conflict or encounter obstacles to their work. The amount of time that a team takes in this forming stage, we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later, but it's not unusual for this to take between 20 and 40% of the lifetime of the group. that it might take in this forming stage. Moving out of that forming stage as quickly as possible to the next stage is going to be important for overall success. In the Wetton and Cameron model, this next stage is what we call the norming stage. In this stage, the participants in the team have adjusted to their roles. They have a better, deeper understanding of what their roles and expectations are in the team, and the team is actually delivering some work product. Here, the team members have gotten to know each other a little bit. They're building trust, and they're demonstrating mutual concern for each other. However, they still are not at that high-performing level that we would like to reach in later stages of the development. In the original Tuckman model, this stage was replaced by storming. In that storming stage, team members experience conflict. Conflict can arise over a variety of issues that we talked about previously in the relationship management course. Could be role definitions, expectations, alignment of the goals. There are a variety of things that might cause conflict among the team members. Here, you may actually see coalitions forming within a team, sides being taken, and it's extremely important in this stage that the team have a mechanism in place to deal with that conflict effectively, using all of the tools that we've described previously in the relationship management course. But incorporating some of those procedures formally into the team charter can be extremely useful when the team begins to encounter conflict. Conflict is going to be inevitable. Every team at some point or other will experience some form of conflict. So it's not necessarily a problem as long as the team doesn't get stuck in that position and can effectively deal with it when it does come up. Well, moving to the performing stage is highly desirable. Not all teams get there, and I think you should recognize that there may be many teams on which you participate where you'll be at the norming or storming stage and cycle between those over time without ever getting to the performing stage. It takes a unique blend of followers and leaders along with alignment of goals to make sure that a team moves to that performing stage. In engineering teams, frequently the team has a limited lifetime. It's only going to exist for the duration of the project, whether that's a few months to maybe a few years. There ultimately comes an end to the project team. I would suggest to you that it is helpful for all of the members of the team to recognize that there is an adjourning stage. There's a formal close. This is the opportunity to celebrate victory when the team is successful and to recognize those participants in the team appropriately. Closing out a team effectively sets the stage for each individual's participation in other teams later on. I think it's useful to recognize also that there are internal recycle loops in this development process. Teams that get to that storming stage, once they've resolved the conflict, may revert back to a norming stage. This would be expected, and that may be necessary before that team can move from the norming to the higher performing stage. It is also possible for the norming team to move to that higher performing level. So recognize that there are multiple ways to get to that high performing level, but almost always will involve a norming and storming stage in between. It's also useful to recognize that changes in the team composition can have an impact on these stages of team development. You should recognize that whenever you change the membership in a team, that introduces enough difference that a team may have to devote some time to reestablishing the group norms, integrating the new person into the way that particular team works, and recognizing that you may experience a regression in terms of the stages of team development. Significant changes in the team frequently will cause conflict. Once the team resolves those, it can resume the pathway towards norming and ultimately to a high-performing team. Understanding these stages of team development will help you recognize where you are and what leadership style you may choose to use to help guide these teams to deliver their work products. We've spent all of our time in this specialization talking about leadership. That's because, quite frankly, that's what gets the attention of employers and managers. Listing yourself as a good follower doesn't get a lot of attention on your resume. But it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about the role of followers and how important they are to the effectiveness of teams. So let's take a few minutes to look at the role of followers. Throughout your career, you will always be a follower in one form or another, even when you are occupying leadership roles. The chances are that you're going to be a follower much more often than you are a leader. Without leaders, or without followers, leaders don't exist, and leaders can't fulfill their roles in the organization. When we look at the desirable qualities of a follower, they're going to look very similar to those attributes that we've given to leaders throughout this specialization. Most importantly, good leaders will know how to develop good followers, and good followers will help them in that process. Robert Kelley, in his article In Praise of Followers in the Harvard Business Review, described different kinds of followers. He first described what he would call the qualities of effective followers. Self-management was a term that he used to describe independence. When we think about the language of Stephen Covey, it mirrors that very closely, of being independent. It also follows very closely the language of Peter Senge from the Fifth Discipline work that he did, of describing self-mastery. Good followers are committed to the actions that are going to be done within the team. They have energy to devote to accomplishing the goals of the organization. They have the skills and aptitudes needed to accomplish the tasks of the team. And lastly, they have the courage to stand up to authority when it's necessary, and the leader needs feedback on either ethical or other technical decisions that might come out of the team. Kelley went on to describe 5 different kinds of followers, and he plotted them on an axis of activity versus independence. If we look at the horizontal axis here, that would be considered the activity axis, and the vertical one would be independence. He described, first of all, those who are low active, low independence as being very passive and as sheep in the organization. The people in this category require a significant amount of attention from the manager because they are looking for direction in which way to go. He described the highly active but low independence people in the organization as yes people. These followers typically demonstrate the characteristics of good followers, except that they lack the courage to stand up to authority when it's necessary. These he referred to as the yes people in the organization. Midway on the activity and independence scale, Kelley described a group of people who will follow once others have taken the lead. They're not naturally inclined to seize the initiative and move on. He called these the fairly pragmatic followers in the organization. He then described those that are high on the independence scale but low on the activity scale. These tend to be the people that he called alienated, and frequently in the organization are those that demonstrate passive-aggressive behaviors. They can be very pessimistic, and they can become obstacles to the performance of the group. Lastly, we have the 5th category of followers that Kelley described as exemplary. These are the followers in the organization that demonstrated all 4 of the characteristics that he attributed to good followers: self-management, commitment, competence, and courage. The followers in this category tend to be able to stand up to authority. They're recognized by their peers as having credibility and competence. I would add a 6th category to this particular box that I mark with this gold star. These would be the people that are not only exemplary, but exhibit what Stephen Covey would call interdependence. They are able to get work done with and through others in a synergistic manner. So it's worthwhile asking, can a follower move from one box to another in this matrix? I feel that as a leader, yes, that any follower can be, with the right coaching and counseling, move from one box to another. I think that's obvious from some of the examples that I've seen in my own experience, where an exemplary employee can become frustrated because of poor management, poor leadership that they observe, and actually move from that top right box to the alienated box. The reverse is obviously possible with the right performance coaching and counseling. In that regard, it's worth asking the question, how can leaders interact with followers to make those changes? What are their expectations? So let's look first at the exemplary employee. So let's take a look now at what constitutes an exemplary follower. What do they do that distinguish them from other followers? First of all, they tend to present a very consistent picture of how they perform. They show that independence. They show that they develop networks across the organization. And they demonstrate that courage to stand up to authority when necessary to ensure that good decisions and ethical decisions are made within the organization. Secondly, they're exemplary because their goals align with those of the organization. They are strong advocates for the mission of the organization and act in ways that clearly support the direction that the team is going. So how can a leader influence and encourage the followers in their organization? The first is going to be to know how to coach followers so that they can best contribute to the team, that they can align their goals in such a way that they reinforce the direction the team is going. That comes through setting goals appropriately, and we've described that previously, and it also comes from coaching and counseling. The leader also encourages followers to help him make good decisions, whether they're ethical or technical choices that need to be made within the team. The leader encourages followers to act in ways that they contribute their ideas to the progress of the team. The leader encourages followers to extend their networks, to broaden their understanding of the organization and ways that they can contribute. This helps access needed resources when the team comes to solve problems creatively. And awareness of the organization will help team members bring those resources to bear to solve problems when it's appropriate. The leader will want to encourage his or her staff to have a realistic view of what the leader's capabilities are. The leader will also want to ensure that they create an environment where the followers are free to offer their opinions, to offer their views and perspectives, and have an open conversation environment. That means that it is okay for the follower to disagree occasionally. Now that we've examined the roles of followers, let's keep those in mind as we examine ways to launch creative teams and ways that we can motivate and encourage those teams to become high-performing ones. As an engineering leader, you will be in a position to form project teams. So as you look at forming teams and launching them effectively, I'd like to plant the seed that the formation phase is a key element of determining the future success of the team. So we'll take some time not only to look at the life cycle of the team, but also those things that you can do effectively to launch it so that they ultimately reach that high-performing stage. Let's begin by looking at the life cycle of a project team. If we look at how effective, how high-performing the team is versus time, it's not unusual that we would expect the team to be relatively low-performing in its initial stages. We call this stage the mobilization stage, and most closely correlates to the forming, storming, and norming stages of team development. All of those elements could be part of this mobilization stage. As teams complete the mobilization stage, they're going to reach a higher performing level. Clearly, there can be differences among teams as to how high performing that is. It could range from a team that never leaves the norming stage to one that reaches a very, very high performing level. During this part of the life cycle, the team is highly productive in what it does and in delivering and meeting expectations on time. As the team progresses, it'll reach that culminating or final phase of the existence of the team where they're delivering the final work product. You'll recall from the earlier lesson in stages of team development that I described an adjourning phase that follows at the end of this life cycle. Don't underestimate the power of having an effective adjournment where all of the work products are agreed upon and delivered, and appropriate recognition is given to the team members. Let's now focus a little bit more on the mobilization stage. I mentioned earlier that how effectively this is handled determines how overall high performing the team will become. Let's take the example of two different teams. In the case of a high performing team, how much time is spent in this mobilization stage? It's roughly a third, maybe slightly more, of the total life cycle of the team is spent in this mobilizing stage. And recall that I said that it could include the forming, norming, and storming stages before they reach that high performing level. For teams that struggle, for teams that spend a great deal of time sorting through the forming and storming and norming levels, that could end up being as much as 50% of the total life cycle of the team. In those cases, those teams are going to be much less productive and will certainly not be considered a high-performing team. So what are the things that we can consider doing in launching teams very effectively? Well, first of all, we should recognize that making that mobilization stage as quick as possible and moving the team members through what is necessary to get to know one another, to be aligned on work goals and processes is critical so that we can keep that time short and they can move on to doing much more relevant technical work. What are some of those mobilization strategies? Well, I think certainly as you form the team, having a clear charter or terms of reference that describe the scope of the work to be done, the roles of the team members, limits of authority, and especially the goals, and aligning those goals with the organization at large. I believe that's also addressing the work processes that are going to be relevant to the operation of the team are worth addressing in this mobilization stage. How are they going to do work? And one of the most important work processes that I think should be addressed here is how will the team handle conflict when it arises? Giving some thought to how to handle conflict before you reach that point in the stage of team development will help the team quickly resolve them and move beyond conflict when it happens within the team. What are some of those first meetings related to as you launch a project team? Well, keep in mind that in this stage, many of the members may not know one another. So a focus early on is really going to be on how do you assist team members to get to know one another? How do you build that trust and personal relationships that are going to be useful as the team delivers work? In particular, this is a stage where you might consider doing some icebreaker exercises or team building events to help those members of the team build that trust and get to know one another. Critical to the success of these first meetings is having the team members leave those meetings with an understanding of where they fit and what their role will be ultimately in the team. Launching a high-performing team requires the close attention of the leader. Pick the right people, align the goals, and facilitate progression through the stages of team development along the entire life cycle of the team. With a better understanding now of both leaders and followers, let's take some time to look at how you might go about mobilizing or launching a high-performing team. For the moment, let's assume that you have a mix of both high and low performers in the team, because that will influence how you go about setting up your launch meetings. As we talked about in the relationship management course when we were discussing conducting effective meetings, all of the principles of conducting an effective meeting apply to the launch meetings that we'll talk about in this video. We'll begin by looking at some of the mobilization strategies. And first, as you prepare to launch the team, understanding what the team is about, what its purpose is, and in particular, if you can give any strength and completeness to the scope definition, that will help launch your team much more effectively. So sharing that information will be extremely important to getting the team off to a quick start. If they have to struggle with the scope definition, that will only delay their process of moving on to solving the problem. Make sure that you've provided the background information, that you give the context for the team that's being formed. What are the relevant documentation from past experiences? Are they picking up a problem that already has some background? To the extent that you can provide all of that information as part of the launch team, you'll again give the team a jump start on making progress. Any of the working documents that you have, agreements, contracts, or other relevant documents that are important to the team should be shared during the launch so that the team is made aware of them. Make sure that you've taken the time to identify the potential stakeholders. Where are you going to get external sources of information, resources, other things that you might need for the team to be effective? Helping your team understand who those stakeholders are in the particular project that you're working on will be of great benefit for them as they help manage those stakeholders moving forward. Ensure that you've identified any special work processes that need to be considered as the team does its work. These may be policy documents or written procedures on how certain things are done. Share those so that the team considers them as they develop their work plans and schedules and timelines. As you do your launch meetings, consider that you'll have both high and low performers in the team. They require different levels of attention on the part of the leader. The high performers, as we described earlier, going to be independent. They'll have the courage to stand up to authority and to share information very readily. On the other hand, the low performers are going to require much more direction and coaching and counseling on the part of the leader. So be prepared for that as you set up your meetings. When you think about effective and ineffective first encounters, those high and low performers can have significant impact on it. As I said, the high performers tend to be very participative. You may have to draw out the low performers, or they may actually dominate the meeting in ways that are dysfunctional, and you may have to intervene and use your coaching and counseling skills as well as supportive communication skills to manage those performers. High performers will be flexible. Low performers tend to demand and need structure in order to accomplish what they're being asked to do. High performers will reach consensus, whereas others will either expect decisions to be imposed or require extensive explanation of what the problems are. The high performers will be able to think broadly and bring information from a wide range of resources. The low performers tend to look at the problem very narrowly. High performers, very independent, maybe interdependent, willingly will identify and bring in resources from outside the team in order to solve problems, whereas the low performers probably won't engage very much. The high performers, collaborative workers, whereas the low performers would like to have things either imposed on them or to impose their own will on the group as a whole. So how should you approach doing the launch meetings? As I said initially in this video, you should approach these meetings as you would setting up any effective meeting. Prior planning is extraordinarily important to the success. The more you prepare for it, the more effective the meeting will be. Some of the things that you ought to consider doing is make sure that you share information. Withholding information at this stage of the formation of a team can cripple it in terms of its effectiveness. To the extent that you can, have the scope defined as completely as possible. Letting the team struggle with scope definition can result in them defining the issue incorrectly and actually working on the wrong problem. Make sure that you've asked for commitment on the part of the team members to participate in the process. To the extent that you might have to do this, ensure that the managers of those team members, if you're drawing from in a multidisciplinary team, make sure that those managers have bought in and are willing to commit the time of their staff to your particular project. Getting the commitment of the individual is also important so that they align and they'll devote the energy that's needed to align their personal goals with those of the team that you're forming. Talk about how you're going to work. What are those group norms that we talked about in the forming stage in building effective teams? Make sure that they're identified and, to the extent you can, document them. As with all meetings, make sure that you end with a summary and a clear understanding of what are the next step. No participant in the team or in the meeting should leave without understanding what they're going to do next for the benefit of the team. Getting a good start is vitally important to the long-term success of any team. With a well-planned and executed mobilization, you can set the stage for your teams to move very quickly from that forming stage onto a high-performing stage. I've emphasized the importance of a good start in getting teams off to becoming highly effective. What are the consequences if a team doesn't get a good start and doesn't launch well? Let's take a look at both cases. We'll begin with what we call the self-fueling spiral of team success, upward team success. This begins with the effective launch, where all of the team participates, you get good scope definition, there's high enthusiasm, and the team moves forward very quickly to move out of the forming stage. They get good problem definition and they develop good work processes that will help them be effective. When conflict occurs in the group, they will engage that conflict in ways that they can learn from it as opposed to avoid it. This is what Peter Senge would refer to as a learning organization. Rather than avoiding conflict, they will embrace it. The team begins to achieve success. They're seeing progress on the goals and perhaps even an end in sight. When they do get to the end, there's a heroic and enthusiastic push driving the team to completion. At the completion of the project, the members of this team feel exhilarated, and everyone has learned from the experience and is ready to move on to the next challenging team experience that they'll have. What happens when the reverse is the case and the team doesn't get off to a strong start? If you fail to provide the information and the structure and the scope that helps that team get through the forming stage very rapidly, confusion can be the result. The team will struggle to fill in the information gaps. And when that happens, dysfunctional or time-wasting behaviors can become the norm. When conflict arises, the team, rather than embrace it and learn from it, will avoid it. Or that conflict can result in damaged relationships within the team that further prevent the team from being able to deliver. As the group continues the struggle, it won't deliver effectively. The quality of the work will not be what you're expecting it to be. And that will result in a very stressful, difficult finish to the project, as the participants in the team will be thankful that the experience is over and will, upon reflection, realize that they didn't learn very much from the particular team experience. As I've said before, your actions as a leader in mobilizing and launching teams sets the trajectory for either that upward spiral to success or the downward spiral to poor performance and despair. One spiral leads to exhilaration, the other to discontent. Your actions as a leader will in large part determine which trajectory your teams follow. Throughout this module, we've talked about high-performing teams, beginning with tracking them through the stages of team development. We talked about the life cycle of teams, and then we actually described the upward spiral of success experienced by high-performing teams. But by way of summary, let's take a more detailed look at what the attributes might be of a high-performing team and what it might be like to work inside one. First of all, high-performing teams are action-oriented. The people in the team are going to work closely together and get more by working together than if they were working individually. The team will have a shared purpose, a common goal, behind which all of the team members can devote their energy and commit to action. They'll be mutually dependent. They'll develop work relationships where they work synergistically with each other as opposed to separate and distinct. As the team evolves, you'll see roles within the team become much more blurred. Leadership may actually rotate from member to member depending on the task at hand. The leaders and followers within the team will all jump in to do what's necessary to get the work done without waiting to be told. The members of the team will develop trust and caring for each other in such a way that they will openly and honestly help others achieve their goals, and also in particular deal with conflict as it arises. The quality of the work will rise and the productivity of the team will grow substantially as the team learns as it moves along. In particular, trust will be built as the team progresses such that the teams have confidence in one another and realize that each individual is not only aligned with the team goals, but is working in the best interests of the team. The team will become much more confident in its ability to tackle challenging problems, so the self-efficacy of the team will grow dramatically. It's my sincere hope for you as you progress in your career and create high-performing teams that you get to experience the exhilaration that comes with being on a high-performing team. Welcome to the Toolkit segment for this module. For now, I would like you to consider the situation where you're a manager and you have formed a team of skilled individuals, skilled engineers that will be reporting to you. As you think about the stages of team development, how might you want to adapt your leadership style to suit the stage of team development? From my experience in Boy Scouts, we adapted what we called the leading edge. This is an acronym that stands for those attributes of your leadership style that you might want to employ at a particular stage of team development. The first of these is explaining. Explaining is what you might do for a team that is newly forming. You're going to spend a great deal of time sharing information, talking about the vision and the mission and what the goals are for the particular work that's being assigned to that team. You want to make sure that the scope of the work being done is clearly established and that the boundaries and authorities of the team are clearly understood. What is the deliverable? Making sure that the team understands what the end result of the project will be and what its value is. Make sure that performance expectations are understood, standards of behavior, and maybe even some team norms are addressed early in the formation of the team. During this stage, the manager will probably closely supervise the activities of the team to make sure that they get off on a good start and that they minimize the amount of time that they spend in this forming stage. As the team develops further, they may reach that storming stage, and here the manager may choose to adapt a demonstrating style where they are going to show the team what kind of behaviors are acceptable and clearly lead the team through the conflicts that they are likely to experience. You may have to facilitate some of the group processes in this regard to make sure that conflict is addressed appropriately. They're going to want to demonstrate through their own behavior and their own role modeling experience what right looks like. Show how to behave appropriately in a situation where there is conflict so that you can build the right behaviors and the emotional intelligence within the team. Make sure that supportive communication techniques are employed and that where necessary to resolve conflicts, effective use of the ladder of inference is in place. Look for those win-win solutions so that nobody loses out. and that you build confidence and trust within the team. Look for ways to use conflicts as a way to learn from the experience instead of a way to destroy relationships within the team. As the team begins to grow and get stronger, they'll reach that norming stage. At this point, the behavior of the manager ought to shift a little bit so that he is less involved in the day-to-day workings of the team. Here we call this the guiding approach to adapting the style. Still want to actively monitor progress, make sure that you're visible and not totally disappear. Do periodic alignment checks to make sure that the group is still on track, they've not deviated too far from the mission and the goals of the team. And clearly you want to make sure that any obstacles are removed so that you can clear the way for them to effectively accomplish their work. It's extremely important here also that you don't allow the scope of the work to increase. This is one of the great pitfalls of most teams. As they get to doing their work, they find creative ways to expand the work that's being done. That may not be appropriate for your particular team. Coach and counsel as necessary. Make sure that you're giving feedback individually and to the entire team as a whole as to how they're making progress on their goals. Make sure that you're providing guidance and feedback from the stakeholders involved with this particular effort, that the members of the team are aware of that their efforts are being recognized and understood by the stakeholders. As the team grows into a high-performing team, there's less need for direct manager involvement in the day-to-day workings of the team. Here we call this enabling. At this particular stage, you still want to monitor performance, but you don't need to inject yourself as the manager into the activities of the team. You'll want to make sure that the external stakeholders are kept informed of the progress of the team so that appropriate support and recognition can be provided when appropriate. Make sure that all of the communications are flowing appropriately between this team and others that maybe have an interest in the activities of the team, and as I said before, with the stakeholders. Again, you're going to be providing feedback and counseling as needed, but not overly so. And most importantly, this is the point in the stage of team development where you as the manager need to get out of the way and don't become an obstacle yourself to the progress of the team. And lastly, as the team delivers significant key accomplishments, make sure that you use the rewards and recognitions appropriately to recognize all of the accomplishments of individual team members and the team as a whole. This then is the leading edge. Nice acronym to help you remember those things that you can consider doing to adapt your leadership style. If you can adapt your style, you will find that not only you, but your teams will be much more productive and successful in accomplishing the goals of your organization. Welcome to the journaling segment for our third module in the Action Planning course. In this module, we focused a great deal of attention on what high-performing teams look like. One of the pitfalls in all teams is what is referred to as groupthink. These are situations where the team avoids conflict by adopting premature decisions and reaching agreement before appropriate discussion has been completed. Most often this occurs where the outcomes align pretty well with the members of the team's preferences and desires. There is, however, a different form of premature agreement that Jerry Harvey referred to as the Abilene Paradox. It draws from a story of a family taking a trip to Abilene when none of the family members really wanted to go. So there are circumstances where participants in a team can reach premature agreement even when the outcomes are not in their best interest or align well with their own desires. The best way to avoid these situations is to have a mechanism in place in your team that allows you to address conflict appropriately and embrace it as an opportunity to learn. If you can do that in your teams, you will find that the outcomes will be much, much more effective. Congratulations, we've now reached the end of Module 3 in our Action Planning course. So it's time to take a look at my leadership observation. Recall that good leaders react well to unexpected conditions. The flip side of this is that good leaders anticipate unexpected situations and prevent them from happening. In this course, we talked about, first of all, the stages of team development. We talked about the storming, norming, forming, and performing levels of the stages of team development, and the fact that for many of your project teams, there is in fact a adjourning stage that follows at the end. We talked about the impact of the forming stage on the ultimate success of the team, the fact that a good start gets the team off to a faster pace and more efficient learning early on that leads ultimately to greater team success. We talked about the role of the follower in the organization, and in particular we mentioned Kelly's 5 types of followers, to which I added the super exemplary follower that demonstrates interdependence. We talked about the life cycle of a team, the stages that it goes through from start to finish. We spent a fair amount of time talking about what it takes to launch a team effectively and the fact that the early meetings of the team are vitally important to setting the stage for later on success. Then we looked at what high-performing teams actually look like, what it's like to live inside a high-performing team, and the fact that they embrace conflict and use it constructively to solve problems, and in that regard resemble what Peter Senge would describe as a learning organization. And lastly, I shared with you a tool that you might use to adapt your leadership style to the stages of team development that your teams might be going through. Congratulations on finishing this module, and we'll move on to how to motivate and provide rewards to teams effectively in our next course. Welcome to the final module in the Action Planning course. Now that we've formed an idea of what high-performing teams look like and how they're launched, we should examine the role of leadership, the role that you may have, in sustaining those over time. And by that, what is a motivating team environment, and understanding how you can create it and sustain it. But first, let's take a look at my leadership observation for this module. Sometimes being a good leader is doing nothing. We'll re-examine that at the end of the module. Let's examine the objectives for this module. First, we will want to make sure that we understand the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards that can be used in helping sustain a motivating team environment. We'll want to look at how do you provide those rewards effectively so that we don't discourage and rather encourage effective performance. We'll look at the role of emotional intelligence and how it contributes to success. We'll examine how to create that motivating team environment and make sure that we recognize the difference between motivation and performance. We'll begin by looking at the relationship between motivation and performance. All teams have rough spots that require the attention of the leader to intervene to help the team move to a high-performing state. Also, poor performance problems in individuals in a team can have dramatic negative consequences for team performance that also require the intervention of the leader to correct. As we think about addressing performance problems of individuals, there are 5 basic approaches that a leader can take. He's going to want to examine, is, first of all, the issue of performance a matter of, does the individual have the resources that they need to accomplish the job? If they have the ability and everything else that they need, perhaps it's just that they just don't have the right resources or tools to do what they need to do. In this case, that requires the commitment of the leader to help address those resource issues. A second approach that the leader might take in addressing a performance problem is to see if it's one that can be solved through training. If the individual doesn't have the right abilities or skills, perhaps those can be addressed through additional training. If that's not the case, it may be a matter that the job needs to be restructured so that it better fits the aptitudes and skills of the follower in the team. In this case, the leader might devote some attention to changing aspects of the job so that it's a better fit, and we call that the refit. If that doesn't work, then the leader may have to consider reassigning the individual to a different team where they're better suited for the skills and aptitudes that they have. Ultimately, if all of these approaches don't work, the leader may have to consider releasing the individual for the good not only of the individual, but for the organization. As we begin to look at performance, it's helpful to have a concept for how it's defined and how the components of it can be addressed by leaders to create a rewarding environment. So let's define performance as the product of ability, motivation, and the situation. And we'll look at each of these components in much more detail and options that you as a leader have to address them in improving performance. So as we begin by looking at ability, ability is aptitude, the product of aptitude, training, and resources. As I described a moment ago, as you look at improving performance attributes in a particular follower, you might address each of these in different ways. We'll talk about motivation as being the product of desire and commitment. Without both, motivation is low. A particular outcome can be desirable, but the individual may have low commitment to actually pursue it. Again, either of these can be addressed through appropriate actions by the leader. The situation has an impact on performance as well. What are the impacts of the opportunities that are available, the scope of the challenge, the excitement that a particular project brings? What are the relationships within the team? Has trust and confidence been built among the members of the team? What are the things that a leader can do to influence that? And ultimately, the environment has an impact on performance as well. And as a leader, you might have to consider adjustments that you can make in the environment in order to improve performance. These then are all of the factors that are at play in determining performance, where you as a leader may have an opportunity to address specific instances that will have ongoing, continued impact on improving performance of an individual member or even within a team. Hopefully, the performance problems that you encounter as a leader will be best resolved by the resupply and retraining approaches so that you won't have to resort to that release approach later on. In the last lesson, we talked about the performance model, the factors that go into producing good performance. One of the things we also addressed in that module were the 5 R's for addressing ability issues: resupply, retrain, refit, reassign, and release. In this lesson, we're going to focus much more on the relationship between motivation and performance. In that regard, we're going to talk about the 4-factor model that's outlined in the Wetton and Cameron textbook. But let's focus now on motivation. Recall from the performance model that we discussed in the last lesson that motivation is comprised of desire and commitment. We're going to examine those each in a little bit more detail. We're going to premise that motivation is inherent in all employees, that they begin any assignment with a fairly high level of motivation. Factors along the way could reduce that motivation in ways that will affect performance. In particular, motivation, as we learned in the last lesson, does lead to performance. Performance leads to outcomes, and outcomes to job satisfaction. This also can be an iterative process where high satisfaction leads to improved motivation. Likewise, the reverse is true. Low motivation leads to low performance, leads to low outcomes, leads to dissatisfaction. So we will want to examine some ways that we can intervene at various spots along this chain to improve, ultimately, satisfaction and reinforce motivation for higher performance. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. We begin with motivation. As we said in the last lesson, motivation was the product of commitment and desire. So things that we can do to improve motivation are related to those two issues. In particular, one of the things that is especially important in helping your followers buy into the mission, roles, and activities of your organization is to involve them in the process of setting the goals for the organization, and in particular, their own goals. To the extent that a follower can be given autonomy and more responsibility in this process, those will contribute to higher motivation. As we look at the linkage then to performance, what are the things that we can do to improve performance? Here, we're going to want to use judiciously the tools that all managers have in either rewarding or punishing behavior. In this particular context, we're going to focus our attention on the effective use of rewards, both intrinsic and extrinsic, as well as discipline as might be necessary to correct undesirable behavior. Higher performance leads to better outcomes. How can we influence the outcomes? Well, we want to make sure that as part of generating good outcomes, we want to recognize that in a positive way, and we want to use appropriate reward systems to encourage and reinforce the performance of followers. Recognizing that the four-factor model is an iterative process for either improving motivation and performance or decreasing motivation resulting in poor performance, we will use this as a basis for an integrative model that we'll present at the end of the module that ties all of the elements together into an approach to creating a motivating environment. With the four-factor model in mind, relating motivation to performance to outcomes to satisfaction, we can now take a closer look at the manager's role in the specific things that they can do to influence that cycle. I'd like to borrow a little bit from the Stephen Covey model of dependent, independent, interdependent behavior and illustrate what we're trying to accomplish with the manager's role being to facilitate the transition from one of those states to the next. In other words, to help the follower go from dependent state to independent to interdependent. As we look at the actions that a manager can take, it will follow that spectrum. In particularly, as a follower moves from dependent to interdependent states, a number of things will change. In particular, their ownership of the activities, their commitment to it will rise. Their locus of control will increasingly become internal. They will feel enabled to accomplish more. Their autonomy will also rise. Their level of authority typically will grow commensurate with also increasing responsibilities. That's the pattern that we would expect to happen as a manager becomes engaged with a follower and identifies those things that are going to improve their motivation, performance, outcomes, and satisfaction. With those concepts in mind, let's look at the factors that influence a manager's decision on how much to be involved in controlling the work activities of followers. First among these is task structure. This refers to the complexity of the task. The more complex the task, the more the manager may choose to be in a position to control the activities. Task mastery refers to how good or how much does the task have to be performed. The higher the mastery required, perhaps the more engagement from the manager in supervising the activities. As we think about the follower's desire for autonomy, those that have a higher locus of control may need less direct supervision. If the subordinate's ability to perform is low, that may require higher manager involvement and direct supervision. As that ability grows, less and less manager direct contact is required. There may be group norms or work processes in place that help reinforce actually conducting the task at hand. The more of those that are involved, the less the manager will have to be involved in directly controlling the subordinate's activities. To the extent that there are effective reward systems in place that reinforce behavior, that too may require less direct engagement and control by the manager, assuming that the manager uses those controls and rewards appropriately and doesn't create opportunities for dissatisfaction or inequity that will decrease motivation. As we consider reward systems, we'll look specifically at two kinds. First will be the intrinsic rewards. These are the rewards that have no monetary value. They're intangible in nature, and an example might be giving a follower more autonomy to do the job where they're desiring that. Second would be the extrinsic rewards. These are very tangible rewards and could include monetary recognitions, time off, or even promotions for those who've performed well. The caution for the manager is that in using either of these two kinds of rewards, we have to exercise discretion in ensuring that we don't use them inappropriately and in fact result in demotivating the follower. As we look at using rewards, there are a couple of principles that are important to ensure that they're done effectively. First is that the reward and the feedback that goes with it must be timely. There has to be a connection between the outcome and the reward. If there's no connection, the value of reinforcing the appropriate behaviors and performance is lost. As a manager considers ways to use rewards and feedback in an effort to improve motivation, there are certain rules of thumb that can be useful as he goes about doing that. When a manager considers using rewards, he needs to ensure that the reward is tied to a specific behavior that is desired. Reward should be applied as quickly as possible after the outcome or the event that's being recognized. In using feedback, the manager should make sure that it is timely, that it's specific, that it's accurate and honest. Otherwise, that feedback won't be actionable and can't be used by the follower to craft a meaningful set of goals. We will use all of these concepts as we build an integrative model for how you can create a motivating environment for your followers. Up to this point in this module, we focused our attention on external ways of improving motivation in your followers. There is, however, another tool that you can use and put in your toolkit, and that is the tool of empowerment. Before we proceed too far, let's look a little bit about the differences between empowerment and power itself. If we think about an environment where the leader hoards power as opposed to distributing it, all of the power resides with the leader. In an empowered organization, the needs of individuals to experience power are fulfilled, and by getting some power, they get to fulfill that need. In an environment where the leader exercises all the power, there's a scarcity mentality around distribution of power. The leader hoards it all. Whereas in the empowered environment, there's an abundance mentality because everyone will be able to experience some level of power. In the power organization, the leader derives his power externally from others, whereas in the empowered organization, that power comes from an internal source within the individual. In that power organization, few people have it. Only the designated leaders have power, whereas in the empowered organization, everybody has some level of power to do the things that they need to do. Because there's a scarcity of power in the power organization, there's a fair amount of competition for that. Political games get played in an effort to gain more power and influence. In the empowered organization, that's not necessary because everybody has some level of power. Cooperation is fostered. In fostering an empowered organization, the leader will want to instill in his followers certain attributes that will help them take on that mantle of empowerment. First will be that the leader needs to create within the follower the feeling that they in fact are capable of accomplishing the tasks, that they have the skills that are necessary to do what needs to be done. We call this building self-efficacy. The leader will want to ensure that the follower knows that they have a certain amount of control over how the work is done, the decisions that will be made, and the timing of the work. This is called self-determination. The leader will want to clearly establish that the work being done is of value and that it aligns with the goals of the organization, that the outcome has value and is of significance. The leader will also want to make sure that the work being done aligns well with the follower's personal goals and aspirations. Doing so will allow the follower to take much more personal ownership of the task being done. And lastly, the leader will want to foster an environment where the follower knows that he can be trusted, that he is assured and has a certain amount of security, that he will be treated fairly as the work is being done. There are, however, some inhibitors to creating that empowering environment, and most of the issues reside actually with the leader. If the leader doesn't have confidence in the skills and abilities of the followers, he's less likely to be willing to empower them. If the leader is insecure in recognizing that rewards can be shared, or if he's unwilling to share in those rewards for the work being done, then that could also inhibit his willingness to empower his followers. And lastly, it could well be that the leader just doesn't want to give up control. They have that sense and that need to be involved in everything that's being done, ultimately because they feel accountable for it. In that case, they're much more likely not to empower their followers. As you go about trying to create an empowered work environment, there are a number of principles that you should consider. First, make sure that you express a clear vision and set of goals. The scope of the work that should be done should be clearly understood by the follower so that they can operate within that scope and understand the boundaries. Divide the work into smaller steps, those that the follower can accomplish and build confidence with each step along the way. In my Army career, we called this the crawl, walk, run approach. Make sure you provide the emotional support and the psychological support that the follower is going to need to effectively tackle the work being done. Try to make it fun. Try to make it exciting so that the follower will develop an emotional attachment to the work. Make sure that you're providing all of the information that's necessary for the follower to accomplish the tasks. Hiding or withholding information will be detrimental to the accomplishment of the work. Provide the resources, the time, the money, the facilities necessary in order to accomplish whatever work is being given to the follower. Without that, the follower will not build confidence and will not be successful in creating an effective outcome. Make sure that you connect the work being done to the outcomes. Make sure that the follower understands the value of the work being done. And lastly, make sure that you build an atmosphere where the follower has trust in you, that they know that they'll be treated fairly, and that you will be consistent and reliable in the way that you make decisions and how you handle them. Empowerment fosters an abundance mentality that makes it fun for you and for your staff to get out of bed and come to work every day. In order to empower effectively, the leader has to delegate work. So what is work delegation? First, it refers to the ability of the leader to assign work tasks and to distribute work among his followers. An outcome of effective delegation is that it increases the manager's discretionary time to focus on other high-priority tasks. If done properly, delegation can be a very powerful tool in increasing the capabilities of the follower through broadening assignments and offering the follower more challenging experiences. It also shows confidence on the part of the leader in the ability of the follower to accomplish certain things, and so is a step in building that trust that the follower and the leader must have in each other. It has a way of building commitment because the follower understands that they will be given appropriate and challenging work to be done. And lastly, It improves the decision making by broadening the understanding of what's being done among more than just one person, the leader. So as we think about delegating work, what are the steps or what are the things that the leader needs to consider on when to delegate work to a follower? Well, first among those is that when the leader understands the follower has the necessary skills and competencies to accomplish the task, then it's very appropriate to consider delegating. If the follower has to be committed to what's being done, what's being delegated, they should be involved in the decision making that leads to the assignment of the task and the definition of the scope for that particular task. If that commitment is crucial, the leader should involve the follower in that process. The leader should consider delegating work when that work will contribute directly to improving the skill levels of the follower and broadening their experiences, and thereby improving their value to the organization. The leader should consider assigning work when he knows that that work aligns extremely well with the aspirations and the values and goals of the follower. In that way, it contributes to the overall success of the follower in helping the organization achieve its goals and its mission. And lastly, the leader should consider delegating when there is sufficient time available for the follower to accomplish the task. If there is not sufficient time, it's not really fair for the leader to assign the task and hold the follower accountable. So if there's sufficient time and the leader can devote the necessary coaching and counseling for that follower to accomplish the task, then it's very appropriate to delegate it. So if the leader is going to delegate tasks to followers, how should he go about doing it? What are the steps that the leader should follow? Well, first, having a clear understanding of what the end in mind is. What is the ultimate goal and what are they trying to accomplish? Not just in terms of the deliverables of the work, but how does the end in mind and the way of getting there contribute to the success of the follower? The leader should delegate completely, and by that I mean make sure that the follower understands the constraints, that there are no secrets, and that they understand the boundaries within which they have to operate. Make sure that the follower understands that there's an open environment, that they can consult openly with others and with the leader when they need clarification and direction. Make sure that the authority to make decisions matches the responsibility given. A mismatch can lead to errors and to abuse, so be careful that the decision-making authority is appropriate for the responsibilities being given. Make sure that you follow the established work practices within your organization. When you consider delegating work, it should not violate those principles or business practices that are part of your organization. When you delegate, make sure that you follow that with the support that's needed, the resources that are going to be essential for accomplishing the task. Focus attention more on the outcomes than on how the work is being done. When you empower and delegate, you're giving the follower the authority to make certain decisions about how the work will be done and the timing of that work. By focusing on the results rather than how, you will not create the impression of micromanaging the effort of the follower. Make sure that you delegate consistently, and by that I mean that you're consistent in times when you will delegate tasks. If you only delegate tasks when you're overburdened, then the staff will pick up on that and will recognize that all you're trying to do is lighten your own workload. If you use delegation as a way of developing staff, then you'll be doing that much more consistently. Make sure that when you delegate that you don't allow the task to come back to you for completion. Sometimes a follower will come back to you and ask for clarification or ask for something for you to do. In those circumstances, you ought to resist the temptation to take the task back and require the follower to come to you with recommendations or decisions that they suggest for accomplishing the particular task. If you take it on yourself, you in effect become the follower and the follower becomes the leader. Make sure that the outcomes, the results of the outcomes are clearly understood, and that the benefits for the follower are recognized so that they understand what not only the value of their work is, but what the potential value is to them personally. Effective delegation builds stronger and healthier organizations, which leads to much higher productivity and ultimately job satisfaction. I'd like to return now to our discussion of intrinsic motivators. You'll recall from our discussion of motivation that it is the product of commitment and desire. Intrinsic motivators most specifically influence commitment. We should never underestimate the power of intrinsic motivators in elevating our commitment level to accomplish higher performance. We'll work specifically with a list of needs identified in Murray's Manifest Needs. This was originally a broader list, but there are 3 in particular that we'll consider as relevant to improving motivation as it relates to performance. First is the need for achievement. Followers need to feel like they're doing something of value and accomplishing something that is worthwhile to the organization or that aligns with the individual's values. There may be need to be affiliated with an organization, to be part of a specific group that the individual values. There also may be a need for power. This power could be the ability to influence others, or it could be the power to have control over their own destiny, to control their environment and the outcomes of their work. As we look at applying intrinsic motivators, there are some common mistakes that a manager can make in applying any kind of reward, either extrinsic or intrinsic. First is to assume that all employees want the same rewards. You will have to spend time as a leader to find out exactly what it is that turns your employees on. What is it that they value? And it's not going to be the same from one employee to the next. The second pitfall that a manager can make is assuming that the follower wants the same kind of reward that is valuable to the manager. Again, everyone is a little bit different. Don't fall into the trap of assuming that your staff wants the same things that you do. As you apply intrinsic or extrinsic rewards, one of the key factors will be perceptions around equity and how it's done. Any inequity in the application of rewards will be perceived to be unfair and can be, in fact, a demotivating experience. Any perceived inequities will, again, result in demotivation as opposed to motivation, and will result in you not accomplishing what you were originally intending to do. And in fact, when those cases occur, you may have to take action to restore the equity in the situation, particularly when you make a mistake in applying recognition or rewards. We now have all of the elements that we need to put together an integrated model of how you can create a motivating environment. We'll do that in the summary of this module. Welcome to the Toolkit segment for this module. We've spent a good deal of time talking about motivation and its impact on performance. I believe that one of the most powerful tools that you have in your toolkit to influence motivation is to celebrate success. As we think about celebrating, why would we choose to celebrate success? Well, first of all, we want to stimulate motivation, provide those rewards that do so. We want to recognize the contributions not only of individuals but of the teams that they're in. We want to reinforce the alignment and the drive to get stuff done among all the members of our workforce. When is it appropriate to provide a celebration? Certainly, as major milestones are accomplished, major goals are accomplished, those are opportunities to recognize the completion. It's a way of marking progress, if you will, and tracking overall performance. Certainly, when a project is complete and the results are delivered, that's a wonderful time to take a step back, recognize the team, and have a great celebration. How do you go about doing this? First of all, There could be financial rewards, financial recognition for a job well done. There could be some intangible benefits. Visibility, public recognition, publications are all ways of recognizing in an intangible way the contributions of individuals and teams. And I think one of the most effective ones is to involve the participants in the activity, either individually or in teams, and their family members in a very public celebration, a party, if you will. Major accomplishments are always an opportunity to have a party. If you want to have a winning, high-performing team, celebrate your accomplishments. Welcome to the journaling segment in our last module of the Action Planning course. Consistent with the theme for this module, which was creating a motivating team environment, I've invited the other members of our RSAL team to be here today to offer some of their comments about motivation. When we do a project of this scope, putting this entire certificate program together, it's about a year-long project. And it involves a large number of people besides those that you see on camera, and I wanted to recognize a number of those people here today. First among them was my assistant to do all of the presentations, the Prezzies, Rhonda Humbird, along with her colleague, Seth Tiger. The one person who was instrumental in making sure that I look good for these videos was Martine Calvi, who's behind the camera. As we think about creating that motivating team environment, the question that I posed to all of my colleagues here was, what is it that gets you out of bed and makes you want to come do the things that you do here on campus? So I'll turn to Gail Moran, who will be working with you in the communication specialization, to offer her thoughts.
Well, I've always believed in the positive power of good communication. And I've often wondered why something so basically human is so difficult. I work every day to improve my own communication, and I encourage my students to understand why communication is important, and I challenge them to work on their own skills.
Thank you. Pose the same question to Beata Krupa, who will also be working with you in the communications course.
Dave, for me it's pretty simple. I really enjoy teaching, and it's a great place to teach. Great students, great faculty, wonderful campus. I really like being here.
On my left, Kaz Karwowski, our RSAL director, who will also be working with you in the project management specialization.
Dave, mine's pretty simple. Somewhere on this campus, on Rice campus, there's a student that has a great idea that will change humankind. And if I can motivate, impart some level of wisdom or some type of advice that will help them achieve those goals and change the world that we live in, that's what motivates me every morning.
Thanks. And on Kaz's left, Tom Phelan, who again will be working with you in the project management specialization.
I think for me it's pretty simple. After 38 years in the industry, I come here to Rice to try to impart some of that experience and some of that knowledge to the students I work with. It's to me it's pretty exciting to see the new students grow and learn and blossom as they understand new experiences. So it's really about giving back for all the years and all the people that have helped me.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. Thanks to the team for being here on this sunny morning here on the Rice campus. It's been a great pleasure being your instructor for this entire specialization on developing your leadership skills. I hope that you take the opportunity to participate in the other two specializations and complete the certificate program. Thanks and good luck on your journey. Congratulations, you finished the fourth module in our action planning course. As with all of our modules, let's take a look at my leadership observation. Sometimes being a good leader is to do nothing. However, this is a delicate balance because the trick is knowing when that is. By way of summary, Let's take a look at the integrative model for motivation that we developed during the course of the module. You'll recall the linkage between motivation and performance. As we think about that linkage, what are the things that you as a leader can do to enable the transition? How can you build co-ownership of goals? How can you remove obstacles, and how can you improve the ability of your followers to accomplish the task to elevate performance? As we think about the transition from performance to delivering high outcomes, we're going to want to look at those tools that you have in your leadership toolkit for rewards and discipline to appropriately address the behaviors involved. As we move from outcomes to satisfaction, your role as the leader is to facilitate those things that will help improve the intrinsic value of the outcome to your followers and thereby improve satisfaction. Keep in mind that this four-factor model is iterative. You as a leader can intervene at any step along the way to help elevate motivation, performance, outcomes, and satisfaction. Congratulations! We've now reached the end of our fourth and last module in the Action Planning course. For those of you who've also completed the Self-Awareness and the Relationship Management courses, you've completed the Leadership Development for Engineers specialization. I'd like to thank you for your participation in this specialization, and I wish you the best as you go about applying some of the lessons and the information that you've gathered in this specialization to improve your leadership skills. While you're at it, you also might want to take a look at the other two specializations in our certificate program.